Chapter 1 of Prehistoric Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by S.K., Edison, New Jersey. Prehistoric Men by Robert J. Braidwood. Chapter 1 How We Learn About Prehistoric Men. Prehistory means the time before written history began. Actually, more than 99% of man's story is prehistory. Man is at least 500,000 years old, but he did not begin to write history or write anything until about 5,000 years ago. The men who lived in prehistoric times left us no history books, but they did unintentionally leave a record of their presence and their way of life. This record is studied and interpreted by different kinds of scientists. Scientists who find out about prehistoric men. The scientists who study the bones and teeth and any other parts they find of the bodies of prehistoric men are called physical anthropologists. Physical anthropologists are trained, much like doctors, to know all about the human body. They study living people too. They know more about the biological facts of human races than anybody else. If the police find a badly decayed body in a trunk, they ask a physical anthropologist to tell them what the person originally looked like. The physical anthropologists who specialize in prehistoric men work with fossils, so they are sometimes called human paleontologists. Archaeologists. There is a kind of scientist who studies the things that prehistoric men made and did. Such a scientist is called an archaeologist. It is the archaeologist's business to look for the stone and metal tools, the pottery, the graves, and the caves or huts of the men who lived before history began. But there is more to archaeology than just looking for things. In Professor V. Gordon Child's work, archaeology furnishes a sort of history of human activity, provided always that the actions have produced concrete results and left recognizable material traces. You will see that there are at least 3 points in what Child says. 1. The archaeologists have to find the traces of things left behind by ancient man, and 2. Only a few objects may be found, for most of these were probably too soft or too breakable to last through the years. However, 3. The archaeologist must use whatever he can find to tell a story, to make a sort of history from the objects and living places and graves that have escaped destruction. What I mean is this. Let us say you're walking down a dump yard and you find a rusty old spark plug. If you want to think about what the spark plug means, you quickly remember that it is a part of an automobile motor. This tells you something about the man who threw the spark plug on the dump. He either had an automobile or he knew or lived near someone who did. He can't have lived so very long ago, you'll remember, because spark plugs in automobiles are only about 60 years old. When you think about the old spark plug in this way, you have just been making the beginnings of what we call an archaeological interpretation. You have been making the spark plug tell a story. It is the same way with the man-made things we archaeologists find and put in museums. Usually, only a few of these objects are pretty to look at, but each of them has some sort of story to tell. Making the interpretation of his finds is the most important part of the archaeologist's job. It is the way he gets the sort of history of human activity, which is expected of archaeology. Some other scientists. There are many other scientists who help the archaeologist and the physical anthropologist find out about prehistoric men. The geologists help us tell the age of the rocks or caves or gravel beds in which the human bones or man-made objects were found. There are other scientists with names which all begin with paleo, the Greek word for old. The paleontologists study fossil animals. There are also, for example, such scientists as paleobotanists and paleoclimatologists who study ancient plants and climates. These scientists help us know the kinds of animals and plants that were living in prehistoric times and so could be used for food by ancient man, what the weather was like, and whether there were glaciers. Also, when I tell you that prehistoric men did not appear until long after the great dinosaurs had disappeared, I go on the say-so of the paleontologists. They know that fossils of men and of dinosaurs are not found in the same geological period. The dinosaur fossils come in early periods and the fossils of man much later. Since World War II, even the atomic scientists have been helping the archaeologists. By testing the amount of radioactivity left in charcoal, wood, and other vegetable matter obtained from archaeological sites, they've been able to date the sites. Shell has been used also, and even the hair of Egyptian mummies. The dates of geological and climatic events have also been discovered. Some of this work has been done from drillings taken from the bottom of the sea. This dating by radioactivity has considerably shortened the dates which the archaeologists used to give. If you find that some of the dates I have here are more recent than the dates you see in other books on prehistory, it is because I am using one of the new lower dating systems. How the scientists find out. So far, this chapter has been mainly about the people who find out about prehistoric men. We also need a word about how they find out. All our finds came by accident until about 100 years ago. Men digging wells or digging in caves for fertilizer often turned up ancient swords or pots as stone arrowheads. People also found some odd pieces of stone that didn't look like natural forms, but they also didn't look like any known tool. As a result, the people who found them gave them queer names. For example, thunderbolts. The people thought the strange stones came to earth as bolts of lightning. We know now that these strange stones are prehistoric stone tools. Many important finds still come to us by accident. In 1935, a British dentist, A.T. Martian, found the first of two fragments of a very important fossil human skull in a gravel pit at Swanscombe on the River Thames, England. He had to wait 9 months until the face of the gravel pit had been dug 8 yards farther back before the second fragment appeared. They fitted. Then 20 years later, still another piece appeared. In 1928, workmen who were blasting out rock for the breakwater in the port of Haifa began to notice flint tools. Thus, the story of cavemen on Mount Carmel in Palestine began to be known. Planned archaeological digging is only about a century old. Even before this, however, a few men realized the significance of objects they dug from the ground. One of these early archaeologists was our own Thomas Jefferson. The first real mound digger was a German grocer's clerk, Heinrich Schliemann. Schliemann made a fortune as a merchant first in Europe and then in the California gold rush of 1849. He became an American citizen. Then he retired and had both money and time to test an old idea of his. He believed that the heroes of ancient Troy and Mycenae were once real Trojans and Greeks. He proved it by going to Turkey and Greece and digging up the remains of both cities. Schliemann had the great good fortune to find rich and spectacular treasures, and he also had the common sense to keep notes and make descriptions of what he found. He proved beyond doubt that many ancient city mounds can be stratified. This means that there may be the remains of many towns in a mound, one above another, like layers in a cake. You might like to have an idea of how mounds come to be in layers. The original settlers may have chosen the spot because it had a good spring and there were good fertile lands nearby, or perhaps because it was close to some road or river or harbor. These settlers probably built their town of stone and mud brick. Finally, something would have happened to the town, a flood, or a burning, or a raid by enemies, and the walls of the houses would have fallen in or would have melted down as mud in the rain. Nothing would have remained but the mud and debris of a low mound of one layer. The second settlers would have wanted the spot for the same reasons the first settlers did: good water, land, and roads. Also, the second settlers would have found a nice low mound to build their houses on, a protection from floods. But again, something would have finally happened to the second town, and the walls of its houses would have come tumbling down. This makes a second layer, and so on. In Syria, I once had the good fortune to dig on a large mound that had no less than 15 layers. Also, most of the layers were thick, and there were signs of rebuilding and repairs within each layer. The mound was more than 100 feet high. In each layer, the building material used had been a soft, unbaked mud brick, and most of the debris consisted of fallen or rain-melted mud from these mud bricks. This idea of stratification, like the cake layers, was already a familiar one to the geologists by Schliemann's time. They could show that the lowest layer of rock was oldest and earliest, and that the overlying layers became more recent as one moved upward. Schliemann's digging proved the same thing at Troy. His first, lowest and earliest city had at least 9 layers above it. He thought that the second layer contained the remains of Homer's Troy. We now know that Homeric Troy was layer 7a from the bottom. Also, we count 11 layers or sublayers in total. Schliemann's work marks the beginnings of modern archaeology. Scholars soon set out to dig on ancient sites from Egypt to Central America. Archaeological information. As time went on, the study of archaeological materials found either by accident or by digging on purpose began to show certain things. Archaeologists began to get ideas as to the kinds of objects that belonged together. If you compare a mail order catalog of 1890 with one of today, you would see a lot of differences. If you really studied the two catalogs hard, you would also begin to see that certain objects go together. Horseshoes and metal buggy tires and pieces of harness would begin to fit to a picture with certain kinds of coal stoves and furniture and china dishes and kerosene lamps. Our friend, the spark plug, and radios and electric refrigerators and light bulbs would fit into a picture with different kinds of furniture and dishes and tools. You won't be old enough to remember the kind of hats that women wore in 1890, but you've probably seen pictures of them, and you know very well that they wouldn't be worn with the fashions of today. This is one of the ways that archaeologists study the materials. The various tools and weapons and jewelry, the pottery, the kinds of houses, and even the ways of burying the dead tend to fit into pictures. Some archaeologists call all of the things that go together to make such a picture an assemblage. The assemblage of the first layer of Schliemann's Troy was as different from that of the seventh layer as our 1900 mail order catalog is from the one of today. The archaeologists who came after Schliemann began to notice other things and to compare them with occurrences in modern times. The idea that people will buy better mousetraps goes back into very ancient times. Today, if we make good automobiles or radios, we can sell some of them in Turkey or even in Timbuktu. This means that a few present-day types of American automobiles and radios form part of present-day assemblages in both Turkey and Timbuktu. The total present-day assemblage of Turkey is quite different from that of Timbuktu or that of America, but they have at least some automobiles and some radios in common. Now, these automobiles and radios will eventually wear out. Let us suppose we go to some remote part of Turkey or to Timbuktu in a dream. We don't know what the date is in our dream, but we see all sorts of strange things and ways of living in both places. Nobody tells us what the date is. But suddenly we see a 1936 Ford. So we know that in a dream it has to be at least the year 1936 and only as many years after that as we could reasonably expect a Ford to keep in running order. The Ford would probably break down in 20 years' time, so the Turkish or Timbuktu assemblage we are seeing in our dream has to date at about AD 1936 to 56. Archaeologists not only date their ancient materials in this way, they also see over what distances and between which peoples trading was done. It turns out there was a good deal of trading in ancient times, probably all on a barter and exchange basis. Everything begins to fit together. Now we need to pull these ideas all together and see the complicated structure the archaeologists can build with their materials. Even the earliest archaeologists soon found that there was a very long range of prehistoric time which would yield only very simple things. For this very long early part of prehistory, there was little to be found but the flint tools which wandering, hunting, and gathering people made, and the bones of the wild animals they ate. Toward the end of prehistoric time, there was a general settling down with the coming of agriculture, and all sorts of new things began to be made. Archaeologists soon got a general notion of what ought to appear with what. Thus, it would upset a French prehistorian digging at the bottom of a very early cave if he found a fine bronze sword just as much as it would upset him if he found a beer bottle. The people of his very early cave layer simply could not have made bronze swords, which came later, just as do beer bottles. Some accidental disturbance of the layers of his cave must have happened. With any luck, archaeologists do their digging in a layered, stratified site. They find the remains of everything that would last through time in several different layers. They know that the assemblage in the bottom layer was laid down earlier than the assemblage in the next layer above, and so on up to the topmost layer, which is the latest. They look at the results of other digs and find that some other archaeologist 900 miles away has found axe heads in his lowest layer, exactly like the axe heads of their fifth layer. This means that their fifth layer must have been lived in at about the same time as was the first layer of the site 200 miles away. It also may mean that the people who lived in the two layers knew and traded with each other. Or it could mean that they didn't necessarily know each other, but simply that both trade with a third group at about the same time. You can see that the more we dig and find, the more clearly the main facts begin to stand out. We begin to be more sure of which people lived at the same time, which earlier and which later. We begin to know who traded with whom and which people seemed to live off by themselves. We begin to find enough skeletons in burials so that the physical anthropologists can tell us what the people looked like. We get animal bones, and a paleontologist may tell us that they are all bones of wild animals, or he may tell us that some or most of the bones are those of domesticated animals, for instance sheep or cattle, and therefore the people must have kept herds. More important than anything else, as a structure grows more complicated and the materials increase, is the fact that a sort of history of human activity does begin to appear. The habits or traditions that men formed in the making of their tools and in the ways they did things begin to stand out for us. How characteristic were these habits and traditions? What areas did they spread over? How long did they last? We watch the different tools and the traces of the way things were done, how the burials were arranged, what the living places were like, and so on. We wonder about the people themselves, for the traces of habits and traditions are useful to us only as clues to the men who once had them. So we ask the physical anthropologists about the skeletons that we found in the burials. The physical anthropologists tell us about the anatomy and the similarities and differences which the skeletons show when compared with other skeletons. The physical anthropologists are even working on a method, chemical tests of the bones, which will enable them to discover what the blood type may have been. One thing is sure, we have never found a group of skeletons so absolutely similar among themselves, so cast from a single mold, so to speak, that we could claim to have a pure race. I am sure we never shall. We become particularly interested in any signs of change, when new materials and tool types and ways of doing things replace old ones. We watch for signs of social change and progress in one way or another. We must do all this without one word of written history to aid us. Everything we are concerned with goes back to the time before men learned to write. That is the prehistorian's job, to find out what happened before history began. End of Chapter 1. How we learn about prehistoric men. Recording by S.K. Edison, New Jersey. Chapter 2 of Prehistoric Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by S.K. Edison, New Jersey. Prehistoric Men by Robert J. Braidwood. Chapter 2. The Changing World in Which Prehistoric Men Lived. Mankind, we'll say, is at least 500,000 years old. It is very hard to understand how long a time 500,000 years really is. If we were to compare this whole length of time to one day, we'd get something like this. The present time is midnight, and Jesus was born just 5 minutes and 36 seconds ago. earliest history began less than 15 minutes ago. Everything before 1145 was in prehistoric time. Or maybe we can grasp the length of time better in terms of generations. As you know, primitive peoples tend to marry and have children rather early in life. So suppose we say that 20 years will make an average generation. At this rate, there would be 25,000 generations in a half-million years. But our United States is much less than 10 generations old. 25 generations take us back before the time of Columbus. Julius Caesar was alive just 100 generations ago. David was king of Israel less than 150 generations ago. 250 generations take us back to the beginning of the written history. And there were 24,750 generations of men before written history began. I should probably tell you that there is a new method of prehistoric dating which would cut the earliest dates in my reckoning almost in half. Dr. Cesare Emiliani, combining radioactive C14 and chemical oxygen isotope methods in the study of deep-sea borings, has developed a system which would lower the total range of human prehistory to about 300,000 years. The system is still too new to have had general examination and testing. Hence, I have not used it in this book. It would mainly affect the dates earlier than 25,000 years ago. Changes in environment. The Earth probably hasn't changed much in the last 5,000 years, 250 generations. Men have built things on its surface and dug into it and drawn boundaries on maps of it, but the places where rivers, lakes, seas, and mountains now stand have changed very little. In earlier times, the Earth looked very different. Geologists call the last great geological period the Pleistocene. It began somewhere between 500,000 and 1,000,000 years ago and was a time of great changes. Sometimes we call it the Ice Age, for in the Pleistocene there were at least 3 or 4 times when large areas of Earth were covered with glaciers. The reason for my uncertainty is that, while there seem to have been 4 major mountain or alpine phases of glaciation, there may only have been 3 general continental phases in the Old World. Footnote: this is a complicated affair, and I do not want to bother you with its details. Both the alpine and the continental ice sheets seem to have had minor fluctuations during their main phases, and the advances of the later phases destroyed many of the traces of the earlier phases. The general textbooks have tended to follow the names and numbers established for the Alps early in this century by 2 German geologists. I will not bother you with the names, but there were 4 major phases. It is the second of these alpine phases which seems to fit the traces of the earliest of the great continental glaciations. In this book, I will use the 4-part system since it's the most familiar, but will add the word alpine so you may remember to make the transition to the continental system if you wish to do so. End of footnote. Glaciers are great sheets of ice, sometimes over 1,000 feet thick, which are now known only in Greenland and Antarctica and in high mountains. During several of the glacial periods in the Ice Age, the glaciers covered most of Canada and the northern United States and reached down to southern England and France and Europe. Smaller ice sheets sat like caps on the Rockies, the Alps, and the Himalayas. The continental glaciation only happened north of the equator, however, so remember that Ice Age is only half true. As you know, the amount of water on and about the Earth does not vary. These large glaciers contain millions of tons of water frozen into ice. Because so much water was frozen and contained in the glaciers, the water level of lakes and oceans was lowered. Flooded areas were drained and appeared as dry land. There were times in the Ice Age when there was no English Channel, so that England was not an island, and a land bridge at the Dardanelles probably divided the Mediterranean from the Black Sea. A very important thing for people living during the time of a glaciation was the region adjacent to the glacier. They could not, of course, live on the ice itself. The questions would be how close they could live to it, and how would they have had to change their way of life to do so. Glaciers changed the weather. Great sheets of ice changed the weather. When the front of a glacier stood at Milwaukee, the weather must have been bitterly cold in Chicago. The climate of the whole world would have been different, and you can see how animals and men would have been forced to move from one place to another in search of food and warmth. On the other hand, it looks as if only a minor proportion of the whole ice age was really taken up by times of glaciation. In between came the interglacial periods. During these times, the climate around Chicago was as warm as it is now, and sometimes even warmer. It may interest you to know that the last great glacier melted away less than 10,000 years ago. Professor Ernst Antevs thinks we may be living in an interglacial period, and that the ice age may not be over yet. So if you want to make a killing in real estate for your several hundred times great-grandchildren, you might buy some land in Arizona desert or the Sahara. We do not yet know just why the glaciers appeared and disappeared as they did. It surely had something to do with an increase in rainfall and a fall in temperature. It probably also had to do with a general tendency for the land to rise at the beginning of the Pleistocene. We know there was a mountain building at that time, hence rain-bearing winds nourished the rising and cooler uplands with snow. An increase in all three of these factors, if they came together, would only have needed to be slight. But exactly why this happened, we do not know. The reason I tell you about the glaciers is simply to remind you of the changing world in which prehistoric men lived. Their surroundings, the animals and plants they used for food, and the weather they had to protect themselves from, were always changing. On the other hand, this change happened over so long a period of time and was so slow that individual people could not have noticed it. Glaciers, about which they probably knew nothing, moved in hundreds of miles to the north of them. The people must simply have wandered ever more southward in search of the plants and animals on which they lived. Or some men may have stayed where they were and learned to hunt different animals and eat different foods. Prehistoric men had to keep adapting themselves to new environments, and those who were most adaptive were most successful. Other changes. Changes took place in the men themselves as well as in the ways they lived. As time went on, they made better tools and weapons. Then, too, we begin to find signs of how they started thinking of other things than food and the tools to get it with. We find that they painted on the walls of caves and decorated their tools. We find that they buried their dead. At about the time when the last great glacier was finally melting away, men in the Near East made the first basic change in human economy. They began to plant grain, and they learned to raise and herd certain animals. This meant that they could store food in granaries and on the hoof against the bad times of the year. This first really basic change in man's way of living has been called the food-producing revolution. By the time it happened, a modern kind of climate was beginning. Men had already grown to look as they do now. Know-how and ways of living had developed and progressed, slowly but surely, up to a point. It was impossible for men to go beyond that point if they only hunted and fished and gathered wild foods. Once the basic change was made, once the food-producing revolution became effective, technology leaped ahead, and civilization and written history soon began. End of Chapter 2. The Changing World in Which Prehistoric Men Lived. Recording by S.K. Edison, New Jersey. Chapter 3 of Prehistoric Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by S.K. Edison, New Jersey. Prehistoric Men by Robert J. Braidwood. Chapter 3. Prehistoric Men Themselves. Do we know where man originated? For a long time, some scientists thought the cradle of mankind was in Central Asia. Other scientists insisted it was in Africa, and still others said it might have been in Europe. Actually, we don't know where it was. We don't even know that there was only one cradle. If we had to choose a cradle at this moment, we would probably say Africa. But the southern portions of Asia and Europe may also have been included in the general area. The scene of the early development of mankind was certainly the Old World. It is pretty certain men didn't reach North or South America until almost the end of the Ice Age. Had they done so earlier, we would certainly have found some trace of them by now. The earliest tools we have yet found come from Central and South Africa. By the dating system I am using, these tools must be over 500,000 years old. There are now reports that a few such early tools have been found at the Sterkfontein cave in South Africa, along with the bones of small fossil men called Australopithecines. Not all scientists would agree that the Australopithecines were men, or would agree that the tools were made by the Australopithecines themselves. For these sticklers, the earliest bones of men came from the island of Java. The date would be about 450,000 years ago. So far, we have not yet found the tools which we suppose these earliest men in the Far East must have made. Let me say it another way. How old are these earliest traces of men we now have? Over 500,000 years. This was a time when the first alpine glaciation was happening in the north. What has been found so far? The tools which the men of those times made in different parts of Africa. It is now fairly generally agreed that the men who made the tools were the Australopithecines. There is also a more man-like jawbone at Kanam in Kenya, but its find spot has been questioned. The next earliest bones we have were found in Java, and they may be almost 100,000 years younger than the earliest African finds. We haven't yet found the tools of these early Javanese. Our knowledge of tool using in Africa spreads quickly as time goes on. Soon after the appearance of tools in the south, we shall have them from as far north as Algeria. Very soon after the earliest Javanese come the bones of slightly more developed people in Java and the jawbone of a man who once lived in what is now Germany. The same general glacial beds which yielded the later Javanese bones and the German jawbone also include tools. These finds come from the time of the second alpine glaciation. So this is the situation. By the time of the end of the second alpine or first continental glaciation, say 400,000 years ago, we have traces of men from the extremes of the more southerly portions of the Old World, South Africa, Eastern Asia, and Western Europe. There are also some traces of men in the middle ground. In fact, Professor Franz Weidenreich believed that creatures who were the immediate ancestors of men had already spread over Europe, Africa, and Asia by the time the Ice Age began. We certainly have no reason to disbelieve this, but fortunate accidents of discovery have not yet given us the evidence to prove it. Men and apes. Many people used to get extremely upset at the ill-formed notion that man descended from the apes. Such words were much more likely to start fights or monkey trials than the correct notion that all living animals, including man, ascended or evolved from a single-cell organism which lived in the primeval seas hundreds of millions of years ago. Men are mammals of the order called primates, and man's living relatives are the great apes. Men didn't descend from the apes or apes from men, and mankind must have had much closer relatives who have since become extinct. Men stand erect. They also walk and run on their 2 feet. Apes are happiest in trees, swinging with their arms from branch to branch. Few branches of trees will hold the mighty gorilla, although he still manages to sleep in trees. Apes can't stand really erect in our sense, and when they have to run on the ground, they use the knuckles of their hands as well as their feet. A key group of fossil bones here are the South African Australopithecines. These are called the Australopithecini, or man-apes, or sometimes even ape-men. We do not know that they were directly ancestral to men, but they can hardly have been so to apes. Presently, I'll describe them a bit more. The reason I mentioned them here is that while they had brains no larger than those of apes, their hip bones were enough like ours so that they must have stood erect. There is no good reason to think they couldn't have walked as we do. Brains, hands, and tools. Whether the Australopithecines were our ancestors or not, the proper ancestors of men must have been able to stand erect and to walk on their 2 feet. 3 further important things probably were involved. next before they could become men proper. These are: 1. The increasing size and development of the brain; 2. The increasing usefulness, specialization of the thumb and hand; 3. The use of tools. Nobody knows which of these three is most important, or which came first. Most probably, the growth of all three things was very much blended together. If you think about each of the things, you will see what I mean. Unless your hand is more flexible than a paw, and your thumb will work against or oppose your fingers, you can't hold a tool very well. But you wouldn't get the idea of using a tool unless you had enough brain to help you see cause and effect. And it is rather hard to see how your hand and brain would develop unless they had something to practice on, like using tools. In Professor Krogman's words, the hand must become the obedient servant of the eye and the brain. It is the coordination of these things that counts. Many other things must have been happening to the bodies of the creatures who were the ancestors of men. Our ancestors had to develop organs of speech. More than that, they had to get the idea of letting certain sounds made with these speech organs have certain meanings. All this must have gone very slowly. Probably everything was developing little by little all together. Men became men very slowly. When shall we call men men? What do I mean when I say men? People who looked pretty much as we do, and who used different tools to do different things, are men to me. We'll probably never know whether the earliest ones talked or not. They probably had vocal cords, so they could make sounds, but did they know how to make sounds work as symbols to carry meanings? But if the fossil bones look like our skeletons, and if we find tools which we'll agree couldn't have been made by nature or by animals, then I'd say we had traces of men. The Australopithecine finds of the Transvaal and the Bechuanaland in South Africa are bound to come into the discussion here. I've already told you that the Australopithecines could have stood upright and walked on their two hind legs. They come from the very base of the Pleistocene or Ice Age, and a few coarse stone tools have been found with the Australopithecine fossils. But there are three varieties of the Australopithecines, and they last on until a time equal to that of the second alpine glaciation. They are the best suggestion we have yet as to what the ancestors of men may have looked like. They were certainly closer to men than to apes. Although their brain size was no larger than the brains of modern apes, their body size and stature were quite small. Hence, relative to their small size, their brains were large. We have not been able to prove without doubt that the Australopithecines were tool-making creatures, even though the recent news has it that tools have been found with Australopithecine bones. The doubt as to whether the Australopithecines used the tools themselves goes like this. Just suppose some man-like creature, whose bones we have not yet found, made the tools and used them to kill and butcher Australopithecines. Hence, a few experts tend to let Australopithecines still hang in limbo as man-apes. The earliest men we know. I'll postpone talking about the tools of early men until the next chapter. The men whose bones were the earliest of the Java lot have been given the name Meganthropus. The bones were very fragmentary. We would not understand them very well unless we had the somewhat later Javanese lot, the more commonly known Pithecanthropus or Java man, against which to refer them for study. One of the less well-known and earliest fragments, a piece of lower jaw and some teeth, rather strongly resembles the lower jaws and teeth of the Australopithecine type. Was Meganthropus a sort of halfway point between the Australopithecines and Pithecanthropus? It's still too early to say. We shall need more finds before we can be definite one way or the other. Java man Pithecanthropus comes from geological beds equal in age to the latter part of the second alpine glaciation. The Meganthropus finds refer to beds of the beginning of this glaciation. The first finds of Java man were made in 1891 to 92 by Dr. Eugene Dubois, a Dutch doctor in the colonial service. Finds have continued to be made. There are now bones enough to account for 4 skulls. There are also 4 jaws and some odd teeth and thigh bones. Java man, generally speaking, was about 5 feet 6 inches tall and didn't hold his head very erect. His skull was very thick and heavy and had room for little more than two-thirds as large a brain as we have. He had big teeth and a big jaw and enormous eyebrow ridges. No tools were found in the geological deposits where bones of Java man appeared. There are some tools in the same general area, but they come a bit later in time. One reason we accept the Java man, aside from his general anatomical appearance, is that these tools probably belong to his near descendants. Remember that there are several varieties of men in the whole early Java lot, at least two of which are earlier than the Pithecanthropus Java man. Some of the earlier ones seem to have gone in for bigness, in tooth size at least. Meganthropus is one of these earlier varieties. As we said, he may turn out to be a link to the Australopithecines, who may or may not be ancestral to men. Meganthropus is best understandable in terms of Pithecanthropus, who appeared later in the same general area. Pithecanthropus is pretty well understandable from the bones he left us, and also because of his strong resemblance to the fully tool-using cave-dwelling Peking men, Sinanthropus, about whom we shall talk next. But you can see that the physical anthropologists and prehistoric archaeologists still have a lot of work to do on the problem of earliest men. Peking men and some early Westerners. The earliest known Chinese are called Sinanthropus, or Peking man, because the finds were made near that city. In World War II, the United States Marine Guard at our embassy in Peking tried to help get the bones out of the city before the Japanese attack. Nobody knows where the bones are now. The Red Chinese accuse us of having stolen them. They were last seen on a dockside at a Chinese port. But should you catch a Marine with a sack of old bones, perhaps we could achieve peace in Asia by returning them. Fortunately, there is a complete set of casts of the bones. Peking man lived in a cave in a limestone hill, made tools, cracked animal bones to get the marrow out, and used fire. Incidentally, the bones of Peking man were found because Chinese dig for what they call dragon bones and dragon teeth. Uneducated Chinese buy these things in their drugstores and grind them into powder for medicine. The dragon teeth and bones are really fossils of ancient animals and sometimes of men. The people who supply the drugstores have learned where to dig for strange bones and teeth. Paleontologists who get to China go to the drugstores to buy fossils. In a roundabout way, this is how the fallen-in cave of Peking man at Zhoukoutian was discovered. Peking man was not quite as tall as Java man, but he probably stood straighter. His skull looked very much like that of the Java skull, except that it had room for a slightly larger brain. His face was less brutish than the Java man's face, but this isn't saying much. Peking man dates from early in the interglacial period following the second alpine glaciation. He probably lived close to 350,000 years ago. There are several finds to account for in Europe by about this time, and one from northwest Africa. The very large jawbone found near Heidelberg in Germany is doubtless even earlier than Peking man. The beds where it was found are of second alpine glacial times. And recently some tools have been said to have come from the same beds. There is not much I need to tell you about the Heidelberg jaw, save that it seems certainly to have belonged to an early man and that it is very big. Another find in Germany was made at Steinheim. It consists of the fragmentary skull of a man. It is very important because of its relative completeness, but it has not yet been fully studied. The bone is thick, but the back of the head is neither very low nor primitive, and the face is also not primitive. The forehead does, however, have big ridges over the eyes. The more fragmentary skull from Swanscombe in England has been much more carefully studied. Only the top and back of that skull have been found. Since the skull rounds up nicely, it has been assumed that the face and forehead must have been quite modern. Careful comparison with Steinheim shows that this was not necessarily so. This is important because it bears on the question of how early truly modern man appeared. Recently, two fragmentary jaws were found at Ternafine in Algeria, northwest Africa. They look like the jaws of Peking men. Tools were found with them. Since no jaws have yet been found at Steinheim or Swanscombe, but the time is the same, one wonders if these people had jaws like those of Ternafine. What happened to Java and Peking men? Professor Weidenreich thought that there were at least a dozen ways in which Peking man resembled the modern Mongoloids. This would seem to indicate that Peking man was really just a very early Chinese. Several later fossil men have been found in the Java Australian area. The best known of these is the so-called Solo man. There are some finds from Australia itself which we now know to be quite late. But it looks as if we may assume a line of evolution from Java man down to the modern Australian natives. During parts of the Ice Age, there was a land bridge all the way from Java to Australia. Two Englishmen who weren't old. The older textbooks contain descriptions of two English finds which were thought to be very old. They were called Piltdown, Eanthropus dawsoni, and Galley Hill. The skulls were very modern in appearance. In 1948-49, British scientists began making chemical tests which proved that neither of these finds is very old. It is now known that both Piltdown men and the tools which were said to have been found with them were part of an elaborate fake. Typical cavemen. The next men we have to talk about are all members of a related group. These are the Neanderthal group. Neanderthal man himself was found in the Neander Valley near Dusseldorf, Germany in 1856. He was the first human fossil to be recognized as such. Principal known types of fossil men: Cro-Magnon, Neanderthal, modern skull, Combe-Capelle, Sinanthropus, Pithecanthropus. Some of us think that the Neanderthaloids proper are only those people of Western Europe who didn't get out before the beginning of the last great glaciation and who found themselves hemmed in by the glaciers in the Alps and northern Europe. Being hemmed in, they intermarried a bit too much and developed into a special type. Professor F. Clark Howell sees it this way. In Europe, the earliest trace of men we now know is the Heidelberg jaw. Evolution continued in Europe from Heidelberg through the Swanscombe and Steinheim types to a group of pre-Neanderthaloids. There are traces of these pre-Neanderthaloids pretty much throughout Europe during the third interglacial period, say 100,000 years ago. The pre-Neanderthaloids are represented by such finds as the ones at Ehringsdorf in Germany and Sacopastore in Italy. I won't describe them for you since they are simply less extreme than the Neanderthaloids proper, about halfway between Steinheim and the classic Neanderthal people. Professor Howell believes that the pre-Neanderthaloids who happened to get caught in the pocket of the southwest corner of Europe at the onset of the last great glaciation became the classic Neanderthalers. Out in the Near East, Howell thinks it is possible to see traces of people evolving from pre-Neanderthaloid type toward that of fully modern man. Certainly, we don't see such extreme cases of Neanderthaloidism outside of Western Europe. There are at least a dozen good examples in the main or classic Neanderthal group in Europe. They date to just before and in the earlier part of the last great glaciation, 85,000 to 40,000 years ago. Many of the finds have been made in caves. The cavemen the movies and the cartoonists show you are probably meant to be Neanderthalers. I'm not at all sure they dragged their women by the hair. The women were probably pretty tough too. Neanderthal men had big bony heads, but plenty of room for brains. Some had brain cases even larger than the average for modern man. Their faces were heavy, and they had eyebrow ridges of bone, but the ridges were not as big as those of Java man. Their foreheads were very low, and they didn't have much chin. They were about 5 feet 3 inches tall, but were heavy and barrel-chested. But the Neanderthalers didn't slouch as much as they've been blamed for either. One important thing about the Neanderthal group is that there is a fair number of them to study. Just as important is the fact that we know something about how they lived and about some of the tools they made. Other men contemporary with the Neanderthaloids. We have seen that the Neanderthaloids seem to be a specialization in a corner of Europe. What was going on elsewhere? We think that the pre-Neanderthaloid type was a generally widespread form of men. From this type evolved other more or less extreme although generally related men. The Solo finds in Java form one such case. Another was a Rhodesian man of Africa, and the more recent Hopefield finds show more of the general Rhodesian type. It is more confusing than it needs to be if these cases outside Western Europe are called Neanderthaloids. They lived during the same approximate time range, but they were all somewhat different looking people. Early modern men. How early is modern man, Homo sapiens, the wise man? Some people have thought that he was very early, a few still think so. Piltdown and Galleyhill, which were quite modern in anatomical appearance and supposedly very early in date, were the best evidence for very early modern men. Now that Piltdown has been liquidated and Galleyhill is known to be very late, what is left of the idea? The backs of the skulls of the Swanscombe and Steinheim finds look rather modern, unless you pay attention to the face and forehead of the Steinheim find, which not many people have, and perhaps also consider the Turnefine jaws. You might come to the conclusion that the crown of the Swanscombe head was that of a modern like man. Two more skulls, again without faces, are available from a French cave site, Fontéchevade. They come from the time of the last great interglacial, as did the pre-Neanderthaloids. The crowns of the Fontéchevade skulls also look quite modern. There is a bit of the forehead preserved on one of these skulls, and the brow ridge is not heavy. Nevertheless, there is a suggestion that the bones belong to an immature individual. In this case, his, or even more so, if her, brow ridges would have been weak anyway. The case for the Fontéchevade fossils as modern type men is little stronger than that for Swanscombe, although Professor Valois believes it's a good case. It seems to add up to the fact that there were people living in Europe before the classic Neanderthaloids who looked more modern in some features than the classic Western Neanderthaloids did. Our best suggestion of what men looked like just before they became fully modern comes from a cave on Mount Carmel in Palestine. The first moderns. Professor T.D. McCown and the late Sir Arthur Keith, who studied the Mount Carmel bones, figured out that one of the two groups involved was as much as 70% modern. There were, in fact, two groups of varieties of men in the Mount Carmel caves and in at least two other Palestinian caves of about the same time. The time would be about that of the onset of colder weather, when the last glaciation was beginning in the north, say 75,000 years ago. The 70% modern group came from only one cave, Magaret Eshkol, Cave of the Kids. The other group, from several caves, had bones of men of the type we've been calling pre-Neanderthaloid, which we noted were widespread in Europe and beyond. The tools which came with each of these finds were generally similar, and McCown and Keith and other scholars since their study have tended to assume that both the Skull group and the pre-Neanderthaloid group came from exactly the same time. The conclusion was quite natural. Here was a population of men in the act of evolving in two different directions. But the time may not be exactly the same. It is very difficult to be precise within, say, 10,000 years for a time some 75,000 years ago. If the Skull men are in fact later than the pre-Neanderthaloid group of Palestine, as some of us think, then they show how relatively modern some men were, men who lived at the same time as the classic Neanderthalers of the European pocket. Soon after the first extremely cold phase of the last glaciation, we begin to get a number of bones of completely modern men in Europe. We also get great numbers of the tools they made and their living places in caves. Completely modern skeletons begin turning up in caves dating back to toward 40,000 years ago. The time is about that of the beginning of the second phase of the last glaciation. These skeletons belonged to people no different from many people we see today. Like people today, not everybody looked alike. Differences in the early moderns. The main early European moderns have been divided into two groups, the Cro-Magnon group and the Combe-Capelle-Brune group. Cro-Magnon people were tall and big-boned with large, long and rugged heads. They must have been built like many present-day Scandinavians. The Combe-Capelle-Brune people were shorter, they had narrow heads and faces and big eyebrow ridges. Of course, we don't find the skin or hair of these people, but there is very little doubt they were Caucasoids, whites. Another important find came in the Italian Riviera near Monte Carlo. Here, in a cave near Grimaldi, there was a grave containing a woman and a young boy buried together. The two skeletons were first called Negroid because some features of the bones were thought to resemble certain features of modern African Negro bones. But more recently, Professor E. A. Houghton and other experts questioned the use of the word Negroid in describing the Grimaldi skeletons. It is true that nothing is known of the skin color, hair form, or any other fleshly feature of the Grimaldi people, so that the word Negroid in its usual meaning is not proper here. It is also not clear whether the features of the bones claimed to be Negroid are really so at all. From a place called Wadjak in Java, we have proto-Australoid skulls which closely resemble those of modern Australian natives. Some of the skulls found in South Africa, especially the Boskop skull, look like those of modern Bushmen but are much bigger. The ancestors of the Bushmen seem to have once been very widespread south of the Sahara Desert. True African Negroes were forest people who apparently expanded out of the West Central African area only in the last several thousand years. Although dark in skin color, neither the Australians nor the Bushmen are Negroes. Neither the Wadjak nor the Boskop skulls are Negroid. As we've already mentioned, Professor Weidenreich believed that Peking man was already on the way to becoming a Mongoloid. Anyway, the Mongoloids would seem to have been present by the time of the upper cave at Zhoukoutian, the Sinanthropus find spot. What the differences mean. What does all this difference mean? It means that at one moment in time, within each different area, men tended to look somewhat alike. From area to area, men tended to look somewhat different, just as they do today. This is all quite natural. People tended to mate near home in the anthropological jargon. They made up geographically localized breeding populations. The simple continental division of stocks, black equals Africa, yellow equals Asia, white equals Europe, is too simple a picture to fit the facts. People became accustomed to life in some particular area within a continent. We might call it a natural area. As they went on living there, they evolved towards some particular physical variety. It would of course have been difficult to draw a clear boundary between two adjacent areas. There must always have been some mating across the boundaries in every case. One thing human beings don't do and never have done is to mate for purity. It is self-righteous nonsense which we try to kid ourselves into thinking that they do. I'm not going to struggle with the whole business of modern stocks and races. This is a book about prehistoric men, not recent historic or modern men. My physical anthropologist friends have been very patient in helping me write and rewrite this chapter. I'm not going to break their patience completely. Races are their business, not mine, and they must do the writing about races. I shall, however, give two modern definitions of race and then make one comment. Dr. William G. Boyd, Professor of Immunochemistry, School of Medicine, Boston University. We may define a human race as a population which differs significantly from other human populations in regard to the frequency of one or more of the genes it possesses. Professor Sherwood L. Washburn, Professor of Physical Anthropology, Department of Anthropology, the University of California. A race is a group of genetically similar populations, and races integrate because there are always intermediate populations. My comment is that the ideas involved here are all biological. They concern groups, not individuals. Boyd and Washburn may differ a bit on what they want to consider a population, but a population is a group nevertheless, and genetics is biology to the hilt. Now, a lot of people still think of race in terms of how people dress or fix their food or other habits or customs they have. The next step is to talk about racial purity. None of this has anything whatever to do with race proper, which is a matter of the biology of groups. Incidentally, I am told that if man very carefully controls the breeding of certain animals over generations, dogs, cattle, chickens, he might achieve a pure race of animals. But he doesn't do it. Some unfortunate genetic trait soon turns up, so this has just as carefully to be bred out again, and so on. Summary of present knowledge of fossil men. The earliest bones of men we now have, upon which all the experts would probably agree, are those of Meganthropus from Java, of about 450,000 years ago. The earlier Australopithecines of Africa were possibly not tool users and may not have been ancestral to men at all. But there is an alternate and evidently increasingly stronger chance that some of them may have been. The Kanam jaw from Kenya, another early possibility, is not only very incomplete, but its find spot is very questionable. Java man proper, Pithecanthropus, comes next at about 400,000 years ago, and the big Heidelberg jaw in Germany must be of about the same date. Next comes Swanscombe in England, Steinheim in Germany, the Ternafine jaws in Algeria, and Peking man Sinanthropus. They all date to the second great interglacial period about 350,000 years ago. Piltdown and Galleyhill are out, and with them much of the starch in the old idea that there were two distinct lines of development in human evolution. One, a line of paleoanthropic development from Heidelberg to the Neanderthalers where it became extinct, and two, a very early modern line through Piltdown, Galleyhill, Swanscombe to us. Swanscombe, Steinheim, and Ternafine are just as easily cases of very early pre-Neanderthaloids. The pre-Neanderthaloids were very widespread during the third interglacial. Eringsdorf, Serco-Pastori, some of the Mount Carmel people, and probably Fontéchevaux are cases in point. A variety of their descendants can be seen from Java, Solo, Africa, Rhodesian man, and about the Mediterranean and in Western Europe. As the acute cold of the last glaciation set in, the Western Europeans found themselves surrounded by water, ice, or bitter cold tundra. To vastly oversimplify it, they bred in and became classic Neanderthaloids. But on Mount Carmel, the Skloot cave find with its 70% modern features shows what could happen elsewhere at the same time. Lastly, from about 40,000 to 35,000 years ago, the time of the onset of the second phase of the last glaciation, we begin to find the fully modern skeletons of men. The modern skeletons differ from place to place, just as different groups of men living in different places still look different. What became of the Neanderthalers? Nobody can tell me for sure. I've a hunch they were simply bred out again when the cold weather was over. Many Americans, as the years go by, are no longer ashamed to claim they have Indian blood in their veins. Give us a few more generations, and there will not be very many other Americans left to whom we can brag about it. It certainly isn't inconceivable to me to imagine a little Cro-Magnon boy bragging to his friends about his tough, strong Neanderthaler great-great-great-great-grandfather. End of Chapter 3. Prehistoric Men Themselves. Recording by S.K. Edison, New Jersey.
Chapter 4 of Prehistoric Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Prehistoric Men by Robert J. Braidwood. Cultural Beginnings. Men, unlike the lower animals, are made up of much more than flesh and blood and bones, for men have culture. What is culture? Culture is a word with many meanings. The doctors speak of making a culture of a certain kind of bacteria, and ants are said to have a culture. Then there is the Emily Post kind of culture. You say a person is cultured or that he isn't, depending on such things as whether or not he eats peas with his knife. The anthropologists use the word too, and argue heatedly over its finer meanings, but they all agree that every human being is part of or has some kind of culture. Each particular human group has a particular culture. That is one of the ways in which we can tell one group of men from another. In this sense, a culture means the way the members of a group of people think and believe and live, the tools they make, and the way they do things. Professor Robert Redfield says a culture is an organized or formalized body of conventional understandings. Conventional understandings means the whole set of rules, beliefs, and standards which a group of people lives by. These understandings show themselves in art and in the other things a people may make and do. The understandings continue to last, through tradition, from one generation to another. They are what really characterize different human groups. Some characteristics of culture. A culture lasts although individual men in the group die off. On the other hand, a culture changes as the different conventions and understandings change. You could almost say that a culture lives in the minds of the men who have it. But people are not born with it. They get it as they grow up. Suppose a day-old Hungarian baby is adopted by a family in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and the child is not told that he is Hungarian. He will grow up with no more idea of Hungarian culture than anyone else in Oshkosh. So when I speak of ancient Egyptian culture, I mean the whole body of understandings and beliefs and knowledge possessed by the ancient Egyptians. I mean their beliefs as to why grain grew, as well as their ability to make tools with which to reap the grain. I mean their beliefs about life after death. What I am thinking about as culture is a thing which lasted in time. If any one Egyptian, even the pharaoh, died, it didn't affect the Egyptian culture of that particular moment. Prehistoric cultures. For that long period of man's history, that is all prehistory, we have no written descriptions of cultures. We find only the tools men made, the places where they lived, the graves in which they buried their dead. Fortunately for us, these tools and living places and graves all tell us something about the ways these men lived and the things they believed. But the story we learn of the very early cultures must be only a very small part of the whole, for we find so few things. The rest of the story is gone forever. We have to do what we can with what we find. For all of the time up to about 75,000 years ago, which was the time of the classic European Neanderthal group of men, we have found few cave-dwelling places of very early prehistoric men. First, there is the fallen-in cave where Peking man was found, near Peking. Then there are 2 or 3 other early, but not very early, possibilities. The finds at the base of the French cave of Fontéchevade, those in one of the Makapan caves in South Africa, and several open sites, such as Dr. L.S.B. Leakey's Olorgesailie in Kenya, doubtless all lie earlier than the time of the main European Neanderthal group, but none are so early as the Peking finds. You can see that we know very little about the home life of earlier prehistoric men. We find different kinds of early stone tools, but we can't even be really sure which tools may have been used together. Why little has lasted from early times. Except for the rare find spots mentioned above, all our very early finds come from geological deposits, or from the wind-blown surfaces of deserts. Here is what the business of geological deposits really means. Let us say that a group of people was living in England about 300,000 years ago. They made the tools they needed, lived in some sort of camp, almost certainly built fires, and perhaps buried their dead. While the climate was still warm, many generations may have lived in the same place, hunting and gathering nuts and berries. But after some few thousand years, the weather began very gradually to grow colder. These early Englishmen would not have known that a glacier was forming over northern Europe. They would only have noticed that the animals they hunted seemed to be moving south, and that the berries grew larger toward the south. So they would have moved south too. The campsite they left is the place we archaeologists would really have liked to find. All of the different tools the people used would have been there together, many broken, some whole. The graves and traces of fire and the tools would have been there, but the glacier got there first. The front of this enormous sheet of ice moved down over the country, crushing and breaking and plowing up everything, like a gigantic bulldozer. You can see what happened to our campsite. Everything the glacier couldn't break it pushed along in front of it or plowed beneath it. Rocks were ground to gravel, and soil was caught into the ice, which afterwards melted and ran off as muddy water. Hard tools of flint sometimes remained whole. Human bones weren't so hard. It's a wonder any of them lasted. Gushing streams of melt water flushed out the debris from underneath the glacier, and water flowed off the surface and through great crevices. The hard materials these waters carried were even more rolled and ground up. Finally, such materials were dropped by the rushing waters as gravels, miles from the front of the glacier. At last the glacier reached its greatest extent. Then it melted backward toward the north. Debris held in the ice was dropped where the ice melted, or was flushed off by more melt water. When the glacier, leaving the land, had withdrawn to the sea, great hunks of ice were broken off as icebergs. These icebergs probably dropped the materials held in their ice wherever they floated and melted. There must be many tools and fragmentary bones of prehistoric men on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean and the North Sea. Remember, too, that these glaciers came and went at least 3 or 4 times during the Ice Age. Then you will realize why the earlier things we find are all mixed up. Stone tools from one camp site got mixed up with stone tools from many other campsites, tools which may have been made tens of thousands or more years apart. The glaciers mixed them all up, and so we cannot say which particular sets of tools belonged together in the first place. Eoliths. But what sort of tools do we find earliest? For almost a century, people have been picking up odd bits of flint and other stone in the oldest Ice Age gravels in England and France. It is now thought these odd bits of stone weren't actually worked by prehistoric men. The stones were given a name, eoliths, or dawn stones. You can see them in many museums, but you can be pretty sure that very few of them were actually fashioned by men. It is impossible to pick out eoliths that seem to be made in any one tradition. By tradition, I mean a set of habits for making one kind of tool for some particular job. No two eoliths look very much alike. Tools made as part of some one tradition all look much alike. Now, it's easy to suppose that the very earliest prehistoric men picked up and used almost any sort of stone. This wouldn't be surprising. You and I do it when we go camping. In other words, some of these eoliths may actually have been used by prehistoric men. They must have used anything that might be handy when they needed it. We could have figured that out without the eoliths. The road to standardization. Reasoning from what we know or can easily imagine, there should have been 3 major steps in the prehistory of tool making. The first step would have been simple utilization of what was at hand. This is the step into which the eoliths would fall. The second step would have been fashioning, the haphazard preparation of a tool when there was a need for it. Probably many of the earlier pebble tools, which I shall describe next, fall into this group. The third step would have been standardization. Here, men began to make tools according to certain set traditions. Counting the better-made pebble tools, there are 4 such traditions or sets of habits for the production of stone tools in earliest prehistoric times. Toward the end of the Pleistocene, a 5th tradition appears. Pebble tools. At the beginning of the last chapter, you'll remember that I said there were tools from very early geological beds. The earliest bones of men have not yet been found in such early beds, although the Sterkfontein Australopithecine cave approaches this early date. The earliest tools come from Africa. They date back to the time of the first great alpine glaciation and are at least 500,000 years old. The earliest ones are made of split pebbles about the size of your fist or a bit bigger. They go under the name of pebble tools. There are many natural exposures of early Pleistocene geological beds in Africa, and the prehistoric archaeologists of South and Central Africa have concentrated on searching for early tools. Other finds of early pebble tools have recently been made in Algeria and Morocco. There are probably early pebble tools to be found in areas of the Old World besides Africa. In fact, some prehistorians already claim to have identified a few. Since the forms and the distinct ways of making the earlier pebble tools had not yet sufficiently gelled into a set tradition, they are difficult for us to recognize. It is not so difficult, however, if there are great numbers of possibles available. A little later in time the tradition becomes more clearly set, and pebble tools are easier to recognize. So far, really large collections of pebble tools have only been found and examined in Africa. Core biface tools. The next tradition we'll look at is the core or biface one. The tools are large, pear-shaped pieces of stone, trimmed flat on the two opposite sides or faces. Hence, biface has been used to describe these tools. The front view is like that of a pear, with a rather pointed top, and the back view looks almost exactly the same. Look at them side on, and you can see that the front and back faces are the same and have been trimmed to a thin tip. The real purpose in trimming down the two faces was to get a good cutting edge all around. We have very little idea of the way in which these core bifaces were used. They have been called hand axes, but this probably gives the wrong idea, for an axe to us is not a pointed tool. All of these early tools must have been used for a number of jobs: chopping, scraping, cutting, hitting, picking, and prying. Since the core bifaces tend to be pointed, it seems likely that they were used for hitting, picking, and prying. But they have rough cutting edges, so they could have been used for chopping, scraping, and cutting. Flake tools. The third tradition is the flake tradition. The idea was to get a tool with a good cutting edge by simply knocking a nice large flake off a big block of stone. You had to break off the flake in such a way that it was broad and thin, and also had a good sharp cutting edge. Once you really got on to the trick of doing it, this was probably a simpler way to make a good cutting tool than preparing a biface. You have to know how, though. I've tried it and have mashed my fingers more than once. The flake tools look as if they were meant mainly for chopping, scraping, and cutting jobs. When one made a flake tool, the idea seems to have been to produce a broad, sharp, cutting edge. The core biface and the flake traditions were spread from earliest times over much of Europe, Africa, and Western Asia. Over much of this great region there was flint. Both of these traditions seem well adapted to flint, although good core bifaces and flakes were made from other kinds of stone, especially in Africa south of the Sahara. Choppers and adze-like tools. The fourth early tradition is found in southern and eastern Asia, from northwestern India through Java and Burma into China. Father Meringer recently reported an early group of tools in Japan, which most resemble those of Java, called Potgitanian. The prehistoric men in this general area mostly used quartz and tuff and even petrified wood for their stone tools. This fourth early tradition is called the chopper chopping tool tradition. It probably has its earliest roots in the pebble tool tradition of African type. There are several kinds of tools in this tradition, but all differ from the Western core bifaces and flakes. There are broad, heavy scrapers or cleavers, and tools with an adze-like cutting edge. These last named tools are called hand adzes, just as the core bifaces of the West have often been called hand axes. The section of an adze cutting edge is chiseled angle shape. The section of an axe is pointed angle shape. There are also pointed pebble tools. Thus, the toolkit of these early South and East Asiatic peoples seems to have included tools for doing as many different jobs as did the tools of the Western traditions. Dr. H. L. Movius has emphasized that the tools which were found in the Peking cave with Peking man belong to the chopper tool tradition. This is the only case as yet where the tools and the man have been found together from very earliest times, if we accept Sterkfontein. Differences within the tool-making traditions. The latter three great traditions in the manufacture of stone tools, and the less clear-cut pebble tools before them, are all we have to show of the cultures of the men of those times. Changes happened in each of the traditions. As time went on, the tools in each tradition were better made. There could also be slight regional differences in the tools within one tradition. Thus, tools with small differences, but all belonging to one tradition, can be given special group, facies, names. This naming of special groups has been going on for some time. Here are some of these names, since you may see them used in museum displays of flint tools or in books. Within each tradition of tool-making, save the chopper tools, the earliest tool type is at the bottom of the list, just as it appears in the lowest beds of a geological stratification. Chopper tool, all about equally early. Aneothian, Burma. Chaukutianian, China. Patjatanian, Java. Soan, India. Flake, typical Mousterian. Levalloso, Mousterian. Levalloisian, Thyacian, Clactonian, localized in England. Core biface, some blended elements in Mousterian. Mycoquian equals Archulian 6 and 7. Archulian. Abbevillean, once called Chelian. Pebble tool. Oldowan, Ein Hanek, Pre-Stellenbosch. Cafuan. The early archaeologists had many of the tool groups named before they ever realized that there were broader tool preparation traditions. This was understandable, for in dealing with the mixture of things that come out of glacial gravels, the easiest thing to do first is to isolate individual types of tools into groups. First, you put a bushel basketful of tools on a table and begin matching up types. Then you give names to the groups of each type. The groups and the types are really matters of the archaeologist's choice. In real life, they were probably less exact than the archaeologist's lists of them. We know now pretty well in which of the early traditions the various early groups belong. The meaning of the different traditions. What do the traditions really mean? I see them as the standardization of ways to make tools for particular jobs. We may not know exactly what job the maker of a particular core biface or flake tool had in mind. We can easily see, however, that he already enjoyed a know-how, a set of persistent habits of tool preparation, which would always give him the same type of tool when he wanted to make it. Therefore, the traditions show us that persistent habits already existed for the preparation of one type of tool or another. This tells us that one of the characteristic aspects of human culture was already present. There must have been, in the minds of these early men, a notion of the ideal type of tool for a particular job. Furthermore, since we find so many thousands upon thousands of tools of one type or another, the notion of the ideal types of tools and the know-how for the making of each type must have been held in common by many men. The notions of the ideal types and the know-how for their production must have been passed on from one generation to another. I could even guess that the notions of the ideal type of one or the other of these tools stood out in the minds of men of those times somewhat like a symbol of perfect tool for a good job. If this were so, remember it's only a wild guess of mine, then men were already symbol users. Now let's go on a further step to the fact that the words men speak are simply sounds, each different sound being a symbol for a different meaning. If standardized tool making suggests symbol making, is it also possible that crude word symbols were also being made? I suppose that it is not impossible. There may, of course, be a real question whether tool-utilizing creatures were actually men. Other animals utilize things at hand as tools. The tool-fashioning creature of our second step is more suggestive, although we may not yet feel sure that many of the earlier pebble tools were man-made products. But with the step to standardization and the appearance of the traditions, I believe we must surely be dealing with the traces of culture-bearing men. The conventional understandings, which Professor Redfield's definition of culture suggests, are now evidenced for us in the persistent habits for the preparation of stone tools. Were we able to see the other things these prehistoric men must have made, in materials no longer preserved for the archaeologist to find, I believe there would be clear signs of further conventional understandings. The men may have been physically primitive and pretty shaggy in appearance, but I think we must surely call them men. An older interpretation of the Western traditions. In the last chapter I told you that many of the older archaeologists and human paleontologists used to think that modern man was very old. The supposed ages of Piltdown and Galley Hill were given as evidence of the great age of anatomically modern man, and some interpretations of the Swanscombe and Fontéchevade fossils were taken to support this view. The conclusion was that there were two parallel lines or phyla of men already present well back in the Pleistocene. The first of these, the more primitive or paleoanthropic line, was said to include Heidelberg, the proto-Neanderthaloids, and classic Neanderthal. The more anatomically modern or Neanthropic line was thought to consist of Piltdown and the others mentioned above. The Neanderthaler or paleoanthropic line was thought to have become extinct after the first phase of the last great glaciation. Of course, the modern or Neanthropic line was believed to have persisted into the present, as the basis for the world's population today. But with Piltdown liquidated, Galley Hill known to be very late, and Swanscombe and Fontéchevade otherwise interpreted, there is little left of the so-called parallel phyla theory. While the theory was in vogue, however, and as long as the European archaeological evidence was looked at in one short-sighted way, the archaeological materials seemed to fit the parallel phyla theory. It was simply necessary to believe that the flake tools were made only by the paleoanthropic Neanderthaler line, and that the more handsome core biface tools were the product of the Neanthropic modern man line. Remember that almost all of the early prehistoric European tools came only from the redeposited gravel beds. This means that the tools were not normally found in the remains of campsites or workshops where they had actually been dropped by the men who made and used them. The tools came, rather, from the secondary hodgepodge of the glacial gravels. I tried to give you a picture of the bulldozing action of glaciers, page 40, and of the erosion and weathering that were side effects of a glacially conditioned climate on the earth's surface. As we said above, if one simply plucks tools out of the redeposited gravels, his natural tendency is to type the tools by groups, and to think that the groups stand for something on their own. In 1906, M. Victor Caumont actually made a rare find of what seems to have been a kind of workshop site on a terrace above the Somme River in France. Here, Caumont realized, flake tools appeared clearly in direct association with core biface tools. Few prehistorians paid attention to Caumont or his site, however. It was easier to believe that flake tools represented a distinct culture, and that this culture was that of the Neanderthaler or paleoanthropic line, and that the core bifaces stood for another culture, which was that of the supposed early modern or Neanthropic line. Of course, I am obviously skipping many details here. Some later sites with Neanderthal fossils do seem to have only flake tools, but other such sites have both types of tools. The flake tools which appeared with the core bifaces in the Swanscombe gravels were never made much of, although it was embarrassing for the parallel phyla people that Fontéchevade ran heavily to flake tools. All in all, the parallel phyla theory flourished because it seemed so neat and easy to understand. Traditions are tool-making habits, not cultures. In case you think I simply enjoy beating a dead horse, look in any standard book on prehistory written 20 or even 10 years ago, or in most encyclopedias. You'll find that each of the individual tool types, of the West at least, was supposed to represent a culture. The cultures were believed to correspond to parallel lines of human evolution. In 1937, Mr. Harper Kelly strongly re-emphasized the importance of Commont's workshop site and the presence of flake tools with core bifaces. Next followed Dr. Movius's clear delineation of the chopper chopping tool tradition of the Far East. This spoiled the nice symmetry of the flake tool equals paleoanthropic, core biface equals neanthropic equations. Then came increasing understanding of the importance of the pebble tools in Africa, and the location of several more workshop sites there, especially at Olorgesailie in Kenya. Finally came the liquidation of Piltdown and the deflation of Galley Hillsdate. So it is at least possible to picture an individual prehistoric man making a flake tool to do one job and a core biface tool to do another. Commont showed us this picture in 1906, but few believed him. There are certainly a few cases in which flake tools did appear with few or no core bifaces. The flake tool group called Clactonian in England is such a case. Another good, but certainly later case, is that of the cave on Mount Carmel in Palestine, where the blended pre-Neanderthaloid 70% modern type skulls were found. Here, in the same level with the skulls, were 9,784 flint tools. Of these, only 3, doubtless strays, were core bifaces. All the rest were flake tools or flake chips. We noted above how the Fontéchevade cave ran to flake tools. The only conclusion I would draw from this is that times and circumstances did exist in which prehistoric men needed only flake tools. So they made only flake tools for those particular times and circumstances. Life in earliest times. What do we actually know of life in these earliest times? In the glacial gravels, or in the terrace gravels of rivers once swollen by floods of meltwater or heavy rains, or on the windswept deserts, we find stone tools. The earliest and coarsest of these are the pebble tools. We do not yet know what the men who made them looked like, although the Sterkfontein Australopithecines probably give us a good hint. Then begin the more formal tool preparation traditions of the West, the core bifaces and the flake tools, and the chopper chopping tool series of the farther East. There is an occasional roughly worked piece of bone. From the gravels which yield the Clactonian flakes of England comes the fire-hardened point of a wooden spear. There are also the chance finds of the fossil human bones themselves, of which we spoke in the last chapter. Aside from the cave of Peking man, none of the earliest tools have been found in caves. Open-air or workshop sites, which do not seem to have been disturbed later by some geological agency, are very rare. The chart on page 65 shows graphically what the situation in West Central Europe seems to have been. It is not yet certain whether there were pebble tools there or not. The Fontéchevade cave comes into the picture about 100,000 years ago or more, but for the earlier hundreds of thousands of years, the tools we find come almost entirely from the haphazard mixture within the geological contexts. The stone tools of each of the earlier traditions are the simplest kinds of all-purpose tools. Almost any one of them could be used for hacking, chopping, cutting, and scraping. So the men who used them must have been living in a rough and ready sort of way. They found or hunted their food wherever they could. In the anthropological jargon, they were food gatherers, pure and simple. Because of the mixture in the gravels and in the materials they carried, We can't be sure which animals these men hunted. Bones of the larger animals turn up in the gravels, but they could just as well belong to the animals who hunted the men, rather than the other way about. We don't know. This is why camp sites like Comets and Olorgesailie in Kenya are so important when we do find them. The animal bones at Olorgesailie belonged to various mammals of extremely large size. Probably they were taken in pit traps, but there are a number of groups of 3 round stones on the site which suggest that the people used bolas. The South American Indians used 3-ball bolas with the stones in separate leather bags connected by thongs. These were whirled and then thrown through the air so as to entangle the feet of a fleeing animal. Professor F. Clark Howell recently returned from excavating another important open-air site at Isimila in Tanganyika. The site yielded the bones of many fossil animals and also thousands of core bifaces, flakes, and choppers. But Howell's reconstruction of the food-getting habits of the Isimila people certainly suggests that the word hunting is too dignified for what they did. Scavenging would be much nearer the mark. During a great part of this time the climate was warm and pleasant. The second interglacial period, the time between the second and third great alpine glaciations, lasted a long time, and during much of this time the climate may have been even better than ours is now. We don't know that earlier prehistoric men in Europe or Africa lived in caves. They may not have needed to. Much of the weather may have been so nice that they lived in the open. Perhaps they didn't wear clothes either. What the Peking cave finds tell us. The one early cave dwelling we have found is that of Peking man in China. Peking man had fire. He probably cooked his meat, or used the fire to keep dangerous animals away from his den. In the caves were bones of dangerous animals, members of the wolf, bear, and cat families. Some of the cat bones belonged to beasts larger than tigers. There were also bones of other wild animals: buffalo, camel, deer, elephants, horses, sheep, and even ostriches. 70% of the animals Peking man killed were fallow deer. It's much too cold and dry in North China for all these animals to live there today. So this list helps us know that the weather was reasonably warm, and that there was enough rain to grow grass for the grazing animals. This list also helps the paleontologists to date the find. Peking man also seems to have eaten plant food, for there are hackberry seeds in the debris of the cave. His tools were made of sandstone and quartz, and sometimes of a rather bad flint. As we've already seen, they belong in the chopper tool tradition. It seems fairly clear that some of the edges were chipped by right-handed people. There are also many split pieces of heavy bone. Peking man probably split them so he could eat the bone marrow, but he may have used some of them as tools. Many of these split bones were the bones of Peking men. Each one of the skulls had already had the base broken out of it. In no case were any of the bones resting together in their natural relation to one another. There is nothing like a burial. All of the bones are scattered. Now, it's true that animals could have scattered bodies that were not cared for or buried. But splitting bones lengthwise and carefully removing the base of a skull call for both the tools and the people to use them. It's pretty clear who the people were. Peking man was a cannibal. This rounds out about all we can say of the life and times of early prehistoric men. In those days, life was rough. You evidently had to watch out not only for dangerous animals, but also for your fellow men. You ate whatever you could catch or find growing. But you had sense enough to build fires, and you had already formed certain habits for making the kinds of stone tools you needed. That's about all we know. But I think we'll have to admit that cultural beginnings had been made, and that these early people were really men. End of cultural beginnings.